Welcome to the Truth in the Public Square podcast, a podcast dedicated to equipping Christians to engage culture and politics for the glory of God and the common good. I'm your host, Harrison Lang, and on today's podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Bradley Green to discuss his most recent book, What is Critical Theory? Dr. Green serves as professor of theological studies at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee, and he's also a visiting professor currently of philosophy and theology at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Dr. Green, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Harrison, it's good to be here. I look forward to the time with you.
Yeah, me as well. If you wouldn't mind further introducing yourself to the audience, any updates on your current life and ministry?
Sure. Well, thanks, Harrison. So, I teach at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. Been teaching here 28 years. Hard to believe. My wife Diane and I have been here since '98. Been married 33 years. All three of our children came through Union. They're 27, 25, 23. Boy, boy, girl. Single, married, single. And they're all around the world now serving the Lord in various ways. We're very blessed in that regard. And we helped start a school here in Jackson called the Augustine School. It's a Christian liberal arts school or a classical Christian school. And we're very happy that that's a part of our story. And I love Union. I think it's just one of the best colleges around. I am heading off in a few months to go to Southern to take a full-time position there. So I will be joining the gang in Louisville and excited for that as well. And excited to have this time with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and just praise the Lord for your faithfulness for the past 28 years at Union University. Praise the Lord for what the Lord's currently doing there, and I've just loved to hear the stories of how we have so many healthy Christian liberal arts universities around the United States, and that unfortunately could not be always said 20 plus years ago. And I'm 25, so I'm definitely younger, and haven't been around during that, but I have heard the stories about how there was a little bit of a drift away from a solid Christian foundation at some of our liberal arts institutions, and the Lord's been kind and faithful, and He has really revitalized those schools. So praise the Lord for your time there, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you'll be doing at Southern in the years ahead. Moving forward to the topic of our conversation, you recently wrote the book, What is Critical Theory? What led you to write this book? What did a publisher reach out to you? And what ultimately kind of said, I need to write a book, and how you structured it? What led you to that?
Yeah, so on the origin of the book, I think when you think of 2020, when you think of COVID, lockdown, George Floyd, Antifa, BLM, then the Trump election. It was kind of a wild time. But even before that, the Black Lives Matter stuff had kind of, and critical race theory had kind of been on the radar every now and then. So I tried to wrap my mind around that, and then decided, yeah, but I want to get into the deeper stuff, the deeper philosophical roots of some of those, let's say, critical theories, plural. And so I just started to read. The founders of the movement and the original so-called Frankfurt School in Germany in the 20s. And I wrote a short piece for Ref 21 that I then expanded for Southern Seminary's Journal. And I thought, yeah, this is in my gut. I want to think through this a bit. So I approached Crossway, and they were interested, and so we went forward with it. So really, I don't know, about 3 years of serious reading and writing, and now the book's out. And so, but it was really myself trying to make sense of just a wild time, historically, theologically, philosophically, culturally, and trying to figure out what is the best Christian way to think about what can be a very difficult conceptual set of convictions and issues.
Yeah, you mentioned that you researched the kind of the founders of this cultural chaos we've seen over the past few years with BLM, and just kind of honestly on the left side of where they've kind of had this critical race theory. Why was it so important to actually go back to the founders of this movement to help Christians today to interact with those who have been influenced by the Frankfurt School?
Yeah, yep. It's a good question. So, in one sense, I found critical race theory kind of boring and kind of intellectually unsatisfying. Really, I said I certainly don't want to spend the next 3 to 5 years reading this stuff. Life is much too short for that. but I was intrigued. Well, so I was intrigued by the founders because they were serious intellectuals. They were serious scholars, um, and I was intrigued by so the four I cover, the four I decided to focus in on were Max Horkheimer, who was the second director of the Institute for Social Research there in Frankfurt, Germany. His sidekick Theodor Adorno, who's perhaps the greatest intellectual of that group. Walter Benjamin, who didn't live in Germany but was like them, was a Jew
Mm.
and was kind of their envoy in Paris and brilliant in his own way. And then Herbert Marcuse, just a little bit younger, and the most famous of those four, and the one who had become a rock star in the 60s via books like One Dimensional Man, Eros and Civilization, and the essay he contributed on the nature of repression, the necessity to repress certain kinds of speech. And I thought, well, this is serious intellectual work. And I had a hunch that to really understand some of our current movement, I needed to go to the source, and at least the proximate source is the Frankfurt School, so-called Frankfurt School, because the Institute for Social Research was founded in Germany in the early 20s, 1923, as really a scholarly research center. And I thought they were worthy of attention. And it's difficult reading, some more difficult than the others. But I thought, yeah, this is the font. We can talk about how to go from there to here. But certainly some of at least what we're seeing today, culturally, morally, politically, intellectually, etc., has its roots in the early critical theorist.
For those in our audience who might not be familiar with the term critical theory, but they might be
Yeah,
familiar with critical race theory, if you
yeah,
wouldn't mind explaining what is the differences and then just furthering
sure.
defining what is critical theory.
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure. So critical theory, to get it, I think you have to understand kind of how it came about. So um, these persons, so first, critical theory is a school of thought. It's a set of convictions. It's a kind of worldview or a set of worldviews. Um, and the critical theorists were in a bind because they're all Marxist, but they were frustrated because the Marxist revolution had come in Russia in 1917. But by the end of World War II, 1918, excuse me, World War I, 1918, it hadn't happened in Germany. And so the theorists were saying, well, if something is a worldwide cataclysm like World War I couldn't instigate the revolution, what will? What's gone wrong? So they were kind of Marxist, but frustrated Marxists. Marxists trying to rethink why the revolution hadn't come. And so I'll give you the short version. We can linger on what you like. So they eventually said, well, there's got to be something besides economics that's at play here. And so these people are sometimes called cultural Marxists, and they'll sometimes use that term themselves, more often critical theorists, but cultural Marxism, I think, is a fair term, because they were Marxists who said there has to be other factors keeping people oppressed, right? Because Marxism says that the average person is oppressed by the owner, by capitalism, and they'll eventually rise up and cast off these bonds that oppress them. That was Marx's theory. The theorist said there's other things at play, and these other things are cultural factors, like the church, like mom and dad, like your youth pastor, like traditional sexual morality. Also, and I will return to this, what they call the so-called culture industry. The ubiquitous nature of pop culture and its ability to mesmerize and seduce and keep someone asleep at the wheel and thus refuse to revolt and help bring about the revolution. So the critical theorists are sometimes called cultural Marxists because the cultural components that they saw as helping to keep people in kind of this docile, happy, submissive state of things, and not even to realize their own oppression. And this might be one of the great insights of the critical theorist, if you want to call it that, is they argue that people don't even realize they're oppressed. So you're a student, Harrison. You're a young man. I'm guessing you're not independently wealthy with a seven-figure salary. Just a wild guess there. Probably not even a six-figure salary, but I don't know, right? Um, and you're oppressed, right? So you're working for a seminary president. So clearly, Dr. Allen is a part of a system that's oppressing you, right? Now, if your boss hears this, I hope he knows that's tongue in cheek, okay?
Yeah, yep.
But you're oppressed, okay? You're oppressed, and part of the challenge is the culture industry and traditional theology, traditional religion, your mom and dad. They're all a part of that system which is oppressing you. And so you have to have this so-called long march through the institutions, Rudy Dushka. You've got to take over the institutions and the cultural institutions so people's consciousness will be raised and they'll eventually engage in the overthrow of the system. That's a very short version. So it's a form of Marxism which sees other issues besides economics as central. Now, with critical race theory, you just get that same basic Marxist template, both emphasis on race as the key issue, and the blindness of, I'll speak bluntly, we're adults here, the blindness of white people to their own oppression of other people, particularly blacks, Asians, etc. And so the critical race theory, that world is the same essential playbook. But I will say this, the critical theorists were all kind of as white as you and I, right? They weren't particularly concerned with the black guy, gal down the street. And they generally were only kind of quasi-feminist. They wouldn't count as modern day feminists. And so they weren't necessarily as concerned with the racial issue. Herbert Marcuse's student, Angela Davis, is a segue to the race stuff. But the early guys, that really wasn't the song they were singing. But that general worldview of oppression gets recast with race being the central issue rather than, say, the other cultural institutions which were so important to the critical theorist.
Critical theorists, including those who would hold to critical race theory and cultural Marxists, usually position themselves and say that critical theory is a tool for emancipation and social transformation, as you've mentioned, the oppressor and the oppressed. From a Christian perspective, I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the key differences between their visions of liberation and the freedom that we are ultimately offered in the gospel of Christ?
It's a great question. So you've either read the book or you've done a quick summary of it somehow, because you're picking up on certain themes. My book. So the critical theorists weren't. So here's what's interesting. Language matters. So the critical theorists will speak about freedom, liberty. They'll speak about the importance of the person, and those are all things that can be articulated in a more distinctly Christian way, right? We are concerned with a proper kind of liberty, a proper kind of freedom. We want individuals, if you want to use the word reach their potential, we want individuals to become the persons they're called to be. Now the challenge is, it's kind of, Saul Alinsky, could talk about he who controls the language controls the argument. So Saul Alinsky would be a more radical 1960s, 70s radical. So the language is good in one sense, liberty, freedom, etc. But it gets cast in such a way that liberty is freedom, say, from family. It's freedom from divine authority. It's freedom from divine revelation. It's freedom from sexual restraint. It's freedom from moral guidelines or God's moral law or moral will revealed in Scripture. So the theorists were right to want freedom and liberty, but they cast it in such a way that it's a kind of slavery on Christian terms. And so what I try to work out in the book is that fine to use that language, but that language turns on itself. It becomes perverse if you don't construe freedom in an explicitly biblical way. So I've been married for 33 years. Now, would I be free if I were out engaging in, a serial adulterous affairs? Well, no, I'd be bound to my sinful proclivities, and I would have wrecked the marriage, right? So for the Christian, through moral restraint, we can 33 years into this project of a marriage, covenantally faithful marriage, we get to enjoy certain freedoms and liberty that the person who's committed to an adulterous lifestyle can't enjoy. So you got to choose your freedom. You got to choose your liberty. It's either on God's terms or on secular, unbelieving terms.
Well, and because of God's created order and how He has created the universe in a certain set of ideals, there really is no more free man than the man who is a slave to Christ. The man
Yeah,
who is enslaved to Christ and His will and submits himself to the Creator of the universe, who is perfectly good, perfectly sovereign, perfectly, everything that we could even think of, right?
yeah,
The one that
yeah.
is above all our thoughts and comprehensions. That man is the most free man on the universe, and so that's where I think there's this longing in each of our own hearts and minds to long for freedom. I think that's what our souls really are desiring.
Yeah.
But when it's a heart that is enslaved to evil and enslaved to sin, then we shouldn't be surprised that when those who are critical theorists, who are atheistic or at least deny the truth and reality of who Christ is, we shouldn't be surprised when it comes actually against the grain of the created order. And I think that we would all realize, I think that as Christians, that it has caused significant harm there.
It's a great point. Yeah, it's a great point. So the way I structure the book is there's some good things out there. So Chris Watkins' Big Fat Book is a very good book, and Chris was kind enough to write the foreword to my book, and it's much longer than mine. Mine is shorter and is focused on the original voices of the critical
Mm.
theorists there in Germany. Well, Walter Benjamin was in Paris, but the Frankfurt School folks. Um, and as I read their material, it struck me that one way you could get into them and try to both understand and critique is by seeing the critical theories a kind of religion or a kind of theology, a kind of alternative alternative theology. If you want to be provocative, you could say a quasi-Christian heresy or
Mm.
a heretical worldview. And I think there's a lot to that. So I have kind of three central chapters, one on the doctrine of creation or the metaphysic of critical theory, one on the doctrine of sin or what's the problem, what's wrong with the world in critical theory, and then what's their view of redemption, the doctrine of redemption. I include their discussion of their view of history and their view of eschatology. So kind of those three theological loci. So I suggest that the critical theory is a kind of theology. It's a kind of false theology, alternative theology. They are God's creatures living in God's world under, in a sense, under God's rule, rebels, but under God's ultimate rule. And so they can't help at one level to think in biblical theological categories. They're creatures. They're in God's world, and God has revealed him had revealed himself to them. They've all passed away now. And they knew God but suppressed it. But they still thought at some deep level in Christian biblical theological categories. So, for example, the critical theorists looked at the world and they said they didn't have a metaphysic, but then they kind of snuck one in. So the world is, in a sense, bad from the beginning. Society, families, relationships, institutions, those are all things that kind of cramp the individual, right? And so from the very beginning of civilization, the world's been messed up. Okay. So that's their metaphysic, right? They say it's not a metaphysic, but there is a metaphysic.
Mhm.
As far as so in that sense that they're Gnostic in a sense. The
Mm.
problem is the very structure of reality, where you and I say, no, reality's good, fallen, but reality is created as good. Man is created as good, but now fallen, right? As far as the doctrine of sin, the critical theorists tended to see everything out there in the system. Now, you and I as Christians could argue that some systems are more or less just than others. I think we would
Mm.
both say that. But we wouldn't say that the heart of the issue is having a system, right? Or the heart of the issue isn't baked into reality as the theorist did. So in that sense, the critical theorists are almost Pelagian. The problem's not you or I, the problem's out there, right? So Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his commencement address at Harvard in '78 said, the problem is the heart of man. So in that sense, Solzhenitsyn was an Augustinian. He was a good Reformed Augustinian guy in that sense. So he said, yeah, the problem is right here in the heart of who I am. And the theorist said, no, the problem's out there. The problem's the system. The problem's the man. The problem's the oppressor. So it's kind of Pelagian. There's no view of original sin. But perhaps most nefariously, at least with Marcuse, the redemption that critical theory recommends is a kind of a revolutionary redemption, but it's also redemption through sexual experience. And this is, until you read it, it may not make sense, but this is his Marcuse's book, Eros and Civilization, that through sexual experience, that's how the world gets changed on its axis. And it seems weird until you start to read what he's actually doing.
Hmm.
But so there is a redemption. He even uses the word of the need of a new man, a new reality principle. He uses almost biblical language, like regeneration kind of language. But it's regeneration through sexual experience and pleasure, and virtually unfettered sexual experience and pleasure. So it's really redemption through sexual activity rather than redemption through the blood of Christ. So in that way, it's an alternative religion, but it's also quite a perverse religion. And we can unpack all that stuff on Marcuse if you'd like to, Harrison, because it gets pretty interesting.
No, I'd definitely love for you to unpack that more. But when you were saying all that, it reminded me of two things that I think is important to say. One, I think you quote here G.K. Chesterton in your book,
Yeah.
and like he says, that the real problem is I'm the problem. The
Yeah,
culture
exactly.
wants to say that you're the problem, or my boss is the problem, my neighbor's the problem, my wife's the problem, my children are the problem. But what we really should say that is I'm the problem. And it
Yeah.
doesn't. I think the Christian worldview can acknowledge that, hey, yeah, you can be wronged by your boss, you can be wronged by your neighbor, you can be
That's right.
wronged by your
That's right.
your country.
That's
But
right.
at the bottom line, when we understand the nature of sin, is that we must say first that I'm the problem. It reminds me of who was it at Charlie Kirk's memorial service? Was it? Oh, it was Tucker Carlson. He was like, yeah, yeah. Which I mean, it's been really interesting over the past few years to kind of see his growth in in a lot of ways when it comes to theology. There's still some differences I have. I
Yeah.
just really think he needs to become a Baptist and get discipled. But
Let's work on it.
I don't think Episcopalianism is doing too much for him, and he even recognizes a little bit. But that is the heart of mankind's problem, is that it's our sin, and when we try to use these, I think you described critical theory well when you said it's a Gnostic religion.
Yes.
It doesn't truly see the created order as it ought to, and it sees parts of the created order as wrong and evil that need to be done away with. And then we shouldn't be surprised with all the destruction that critical theory has brought upon people who embrace it. Yes, I'm sure that there's some people who get benefited from it, mainly probably the intellectuals who get more money, and they're actually end up becoming the oppressors when they're saying that they're the ones that are being oppressed by the world system. But
Yeah.
I think that's really helpful there. But then the second point I want to highlight is we already mentioned your book. It is a great book. I did read it, in fact.
Thank you. Thank you.
But
Okay.
Crossway was kind enough to send me a copy, and so it was really a delightful read. But one of my greatest takeaways from this book is it's so helpful for pastors, ministry leaders, parents, and just an everyday Christian to read, who can get a small little glimpse. It's, as you mentioned, there's more exhaustive works out there on critical theory from our Christian perspective,
Yeah.
but what's accessible to the everyday Christian? And then this book is accessible, and I think that Christians, in a lot of ways, should read this, because when they're going to the workplace, they're going to interact with it. Parents, if they're not sending their kids to a classical Christian school, they're going to interact with it. And even those who are getting sent to classical school, they probably should be familiar with it, because they're going to engage it in the culture. So I just want to send you a commendation that it is a prolific work, and I'm thankful for it, and I think that more people should read it.
Well, that's very nice. So you're very discerning. No, just having fun. Yeah. Thank you. It's very, very kind. When I first set out to write it, my goal was to write something about the length of the abolition of man by C.S. Lewis. That's kind of my dream, to write something like that one day. So this is about 100 pages longer than that, but I tried to, and Crossway agreed in principle. Hey, let's do something a little that'll actually get read, right? That's short enough. it's maybe a little turgid at times because it's thick material, but it will, I think. So thank you. It will unlock. I think it'll help parents, persons, pastors unpack certain things. So, for example, why would I'm not picking on all government schools, but why with public schools or government schools, why do we hear so many stories with the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, the various public schools? Why the dogged determination that if Johnny says he wants to become Jill, why the dogged determination that parents shouldn't be told this, right?
Hmm.
Now, you want to also ask, why is Johnny having those thoughts in the first place? It's probably in large part because of what they're hearing at those schools.
Hmm.
But why? Well, it's in one sense it's very simple because what Marcuse, you just got to read. Once you finish my book, pick up Marcuse and just kind of, if you can handle it, stomach it, read what you can. Because what Marcuse helped me to see is that according to at least Marcuse, as a critical theorist, that person who says they're a boy who thinks he's a girl or vice versa, or who just wants to enjoy various sexual experiences, that is that person becoming who they ought to be. And whether it's mom or dad, a youth pastor, or maybe a conservative traditional principal at a public school, they are oppressing that child by not allowing them to become the person they think they ought to become.
Hmm.
And thus they are a kind of fascist. And we can talk about why the word fascist has come up so much in our era. But so there is a religious zeal on the part of persons who, even if they've never read Marcuse, this stuff is in the air. And so James Lindsay, I disagree with him at points. He's right that we live in Marcuse's world now. There's no doubt we live in Marcuse's world. It's all over the place. And you probably do. I have, friends who weep because their child has gotten caught up and think they need to transition or whatever, right? It's a tragedy. The reason that person in this or that school doesn't think mom and dad should know is because mom and dad, particularly if they're a complementarian or they're conservative, whatever, is kind of a fascist influence that is keeping that child from really becoming who they ought to be. And they're a part of the oppressive class.
And if I may interrupt you quick on this, like, this is an important point. When it comes to when governments and school districts are trying to quote unquote protect the children who is desires to transition, it really actually is attack on, I think, Christianity and conservatives, because they're knowing that if a child who wants to transition and they come from like a liberal or leftist family, they're not going to have to worry about them. And so it is distinctly an attack on those who want to preserve the created order. So that's what I just want to add there, because I think that's helpful when we think about that.
That's very good. No, and you're right. You're right. It is, I have, you mentioned natural law and the rest, and I have my own take on that, but I'll agree with my natural law friends and future colleagues here to this extent, that the Christian believes that the world, even in a fallen world, that the world qua created, the world as created, is a good and beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that when Johnny says he wants to be Jill, it's not just a odd desire for a certain kind of sexual experience, whatever. It is kicking against the very structures of reality. Mm-hmm. And if you're a Christian, you believe the world, that God's a good God, he made a good world. And the difference in the sexes are good and beautiful things. And that the best thing, unless you're called to singleness, right? The best thing for you is to remain a boy and to one day enjoy the beauty of covenant marriage and be your own parent if the Lord gives you children, etc. So this really is, and Lewis saw this in the Abolition of Man. He saw it in The Hideous Strength. It's an attack upon upon the very structures of creation, and that's why I think the critical theorists pretend not to have a doctrine of creation, but they kind of do, and it's a problem. Mm-hmm. And so, because what Marcuse says is this: is he borrows from Freud that there's a reality principle and a pleasure principle. The reality principle is you've got to behave and have some restraint if we're going to have kind of order in a culture. So you can't be just doing whatever you want to do, particularly sexually. Then there's a pleasure principle, which is enjoy all the pleasure you can, and particularly sexual. Marcuse's take is this: is that Freud couldn't ever figure out how these two could be reconciled, and so Freud comes up with things like coping mechanisms. How do you cope with the fact that you can never have your deepest desires met, right? And Freud had no real answer besides just kind of live with it. Marcuse says, here's the answer. And this is, it's brilliant in a perverse way. We need a new sexualized reality principle. And you actually change the very structure of the universe through sexual pleasure and sexual experience. So it's a new reality we need, right? Now, the Christian comes along and says, we do need a new heavens and new earth, right? And whatever your exact view of eschatology and all that. And that comes about through the gospel. Oh, and by the way, your deepest needs, your deepest needs will be so met in Christ, you can't even imagine how great that pleasure will be. So we're not anti-pleasure. We're not anti-sex for that matter either. And we're not anti-new reality principle. We're saying it's not going to happen through sexual activity in that sense. It is going to come through the gospel, and there will be a new heavens and new earth. There will be a new reality principle. But you guys, it's like C.S. Lewis says, you guys are like playing in mud and thinking it's real. And you've got this beautiful, sand and beach over here that's real, and you're playing in this junk over here because you're not critical enough. So our critique of the critical theorists is you guys should quit playing. You guys aren't nearly critical enough. You guys are critical theorist wannabes. Right. So thus ends the sermon. Back to you, Harrison.
No, I've been meaning to mention that one of my favorite parts in the book is that you do say that the critical theorists aren't critical enough.
They're not critical enough. That's right.
They're not critical enough of the world we live in. They're so, and they're not critical enough of humanity. In some ways, they're too optimistic of humanity by itself.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
although they claim actually to the contrary, they actually are more. They're actually more optimistic than Christians are when we think about the most bare minimum outside of God's grace and common grace towards humans. They're way more optimistic than most Christians are.
That's a good point. No, the more I read it, I thought, wow, these guys they're Gnostics in the sense that, and I'm generalizing here, right? You can do that when you're a philosopher, theologian guy. You can generalize. They're Gnostics, and the problem's kind of out there in the system. But there's also a kind of Pelagianism that's linked to that. The problem's not my human heart. I'm not dead in my sins. I'm wanting to be a slave, right? Is what the Christian faith, in a sense, says. Is I like my slavery. I have to be released from it, right? I've got to be rescued by a sovereign, gracious God. But it's also kind of Manichaean, right? There's the Manichaeans. There's a good and evil principles that run through the heart of reality, and so and that good and evil kind of is right there in the heart of creation. That's what Augustine fought against the Manichaean dualistic universe, right? The Christian just says, there is good and evil, but it's right. It runs right through the middle of my heart, and I'm the problem. And hey, critical theorist sitting in Starbucks with your diet here, doing whatever, there's room for one more hypocrite if you want to come along, right? So, we got to find ways to, as Dan Strange likes to, say, we need to subversively fulfill whatever's there in the critical theorist and show them the gospel is the only real. The gospel helps get the problem understood, and the gospel helps answer the problem.
In our final few moments, I would love to hear more from you. So we talked about the backgrounds of critical theory, where has it led us, where is it seen throughout today. But the next portion, I think the most important when it comes to probably majority of our listeners, is how should we respond? How should churches respond? How should Christians respond? How should parents respond to the influence of critical theory in culture, education, and politics today?
That's a great question. I would say, in one sense, I'd say if you're in a good church and you're hearing the scripture preached, if you're providing some sort of Christian education for your children, homeschooling, you're in a hybrid, you're in a Christian school, you're in a classical Christian school, keep doing that. I would say make sure, our school ended up drafting something called the Augustine School Statement on Social Theory to help
Mhm.
our community think about this. So if you want to go on, it's published at First Things. It's also now in Wayne Grudem's recent ethics book.
Mhm.
I can send it to folks if they can't find it. But I would say make sure your school gets this stuff. Make sure your school understands the danger of this stuff. But in one sense, I'd say if you're in a good place, just keep doing that kind of good stuff. If your child is in a government school, public school, um, I don't want to pick on anyone who's poor or the single mom who's doing her best. If I were
Mhm.
wealthy, I'd write you a check for the tuition myself to get them out.
Mhm.
But I'd say do all you can to get your children out of those situations because this
Mhm.
stuff pervades the government schools right now.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
if you're off in some county and some small rural place, maybe you're escaping it. Probably not. This
Well,
stuff is
if I may interrupt you real quickly there again, sorry about that. But I had one of our board members is a guy named Doug Ritchie. He's a former state representative. He's former Southern Baptist pastor in the state
yeah.
of Missouri. He now works for Alliance Defending Freedom. But we were
Okay.
having a conversation recently, partially about school choice and the importance of having the opportunity when it comes to
Mm,
policy. And we were talking about like we were actually recently driving to St. Louis. We went through a couple small towns to get there. He was speaking at a church there on cultural and political matters, and we were driving through these small towns and talking about school choice and why it's important. But we think that if we go to like Higginsville, Missouri,
Yep.
small town, 60
Yep.
miles away from Kansas City, you're not gonna you're not going to be influenced by this cultural Marxist nonsense. Like that's not going to be, because you're going to assume the teachers are going to be a little more conservative, school
Yep.
boards going to be more conservative, and by and large, that's probably partially true.
Yeah.
But where are the teachers getting their education from? They're
It's
going to these big state schools
Yep. Yep.
that
That's right.
are that have been they're been indoctrinated with this cultural Marxism that's going to come out in their teaching. So I wanted to say that because I think that's super important. I love how you mentioned you don't want to beat down on families
Yeah.
who perhaps cannot consider
Yep. Yep.
supporting their student, their child to go to a private Christian school or to homeschool. My response to that is twofold. One is like just be sure that you have the home right. Be sure
Yeah.
that you're able to get them in church.
I
And the
love it.
second thing as well is an encouragement to churches is I think that we need to invest more in our communities. Invest more in our churches for those who are less fortunate, and be able to help parents meet those opportunities if the community is able to allow that. And so I wanted to say that because I think that's one thing I'm passionate about there.
It's great. No, one of the joys I had in founding Augustine School and leading Augustine School is when I had the opportunity to help provide, scholarships for, the single mom whose daddy ran off, whatever. It's like, wow, what a blessing for me to get to help provide that, for someone. So I would say, yeah, I mean, get the book, read it. I'm happy to zoom in with a reading group if they want me to come in and explain some things, whatever. I mean, is educate yourself and just know this stuff is pervasive in the culture. And if you don't catechize in the general sense, if you're not forming, shaping your children, they are going to be catechized by the culture. In a sense, you can't keep the culture from them. We live in this world. But you've got to counteract and you've got to train and you've got to figure out what your children are watching. If they're 12 or 13, 14, 15, have smartphones, go throw them in the trash can. Just get rid of them. I'm sorry, just get rid of them. There's no reason for young teens to have that kind of
Mhm.
stuff. Make sure your pastor gets it. Don't be a jerk, but make sure your pastor is at least somewhat aware of these things,
Mhm.
and grasp that part of and for pastors, part of shepherding is realizing there's wolves out there, and they
Mhm.
they want to destroy your children in the name of a kind of false religion called critical theory. So I
Mhm.
know I sound like a right wing extremist right now, but I don't know. I just think it's a wild time. Parents particularly need to be very diligent. Not trying to heap up guilt on parents, but very diligent with what their children are watching, seeing, doing. Take the time to talk. you know, if they're already sucked into social media, just kill that snake. Take your hatchet and kill that serpent, and rescue your children. That's a
Yeah,
start.
I recently saw a clip from Tim Keller, and he was saying, he was like giving advice to young adults who are wrestling what their next steps are in career, and he says, well, if Christ really died, if he really did die for your sins and was resurrected, and ascends to the right hand of the Father, it's going to be all right. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I want to say that, like, if Christians in some ways will continue being in some ways negligent and engaging in culture and politics,
Yeah.
it's going to be okay. It's
Yeah.
it's going to be okay. But at
Yeah.
the same time, I think that we do have an opportunity and a
Yeah.
responsibility, a stewardship, to bring truth in the public square, to be the people who are going to be kind and gracious, but also be convictional, who are going to stand up for the true, good, and the beautiful. And so, I would have one final question for you. What would be some takeaways? Give me one or two, or perhaps three, for our listeners that they may take away from your book.
Yeah, I would just say, I think one of the marks of biblical wisdom in our current generation is to try to think when you, I think a danger in our current moment, there's so many people competing for our attention. So some of my more conservative fellas, if they're kind of geeking out all the time on Ben Shapiro and they're geeking all the time on Joe Rogan or whatever, there can be stuff you can get there that's okay. But I would say you want to make sure you're really forming a distinctly biblical Christian understanding of the social order, of the
Hmm.
nature of reality, of the nature of knowledge, of the nature of metaphysics, the nature of morality, etc. And so don't be satisfied just because someone's kind of conservative.
Hmm.
Um, I'd rather have that than the progressive left wing.
Yep.
But take shut off the TV or whatever and take the time to really think Christianly and try to analyze our current cultural moment through a distinctly Christian biblical worldview and set of categories. And that takes some work. And my book tries to do that with one slice, critical theory. But don't be satisfied by just being conservative in a vague sense. You want a conservatism where Jesus Christ is Lord and you're thinking in explicitly biblical Christian categories. That's maybe one thing I'd say.
Well, and not to give a plug, but also to give a plug for what I'm trying to do at Truth in the Public Square. We're trying to be that people. We're trying to be that. We want to equip pastors not to be reruns on Ben Shapiro or Joe Rogan on Sundays, rerun a Daily Wire, Fox News. That's not what pastors' roles to be. But they must know that their people are wrestling with these issues, and they are being engaged with these issues, and they need to respond faithfully. And also for the young conservative man who's interested in politics. I mean, I have several friends of those who love listening to Ben Shapiro or Michael Knowles every day, and
Yep.
those are good. You can listen to those,
Yep.
but know
Yep.
where they fall short. Know where they're going to be missing the mark, and find those places and those voices that are able to really have a worldview that's submitted to the lordship of Christ.
I think that's exactly right, Harrison. So keep up the good work because we don't just need to be one more conservative voice. We need to be explicitly biblical and Christian, and the Christian may have times where they disagree with the current whatever, right?
Yep.
And need to have the guts to do that well. So keep up the good work. Yep.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Great to be here.